Welcome to Strawberry Chat. My name is Miranda Purcell. I'm the Viticulture Extension Specialist at Purdue University. Strawberry Chat is a monthly discussion that focuses on various aspects of strawberry production at small-scale, diversified local farms. And this morning, we are excited to have an episode on weed management.
My name is Wenjing Guan. I'm a horticulture specialist at Purdue University. I'm based in Southern Indiana, and our guests are Kevin Schooley and Steve Meyers. We will first have Kevin introduce himself.
It's great to be here. I'm located in Ontario, Canada, near Buffalo, I guess. It's only about 20 minutes away. I've been working with strawberry growers for over 30 years, and starting in extension and then private consulting, and have worked with a few organizations over the years, and currently still working with the North American Strawberry Growers Association. And I'm working in Ontario as a kind of a technical consultant role for a Canadian supply company here as well. So I'm happy to be here.
Hi, I'm Steve Meyers. I'm a weed scientist and assistant professor at Purdue University in the Department of Horticulture and Landscape Architecture, based on the main campus in West Lafayette. My strawberry experience mostly goes back to my grad school days in North Carolina when we would do weed management on plasticulture production systems. We're just kind of getting our strawberry research started here at Purdue this last fall with some multi-year plasticulture production research. So happy to be here.
Thanks, Steve, Kevin. Very greatly appreciate you joining our program today to talk about weed. Before we get into our topic today, I do want to give our audience an overview of strawberry production in Indiana. Maybe the same as many other states in the Midwest. We have farmers grow strawberries and to sell at retail market or UPIC in Indiana. The most recent data I can find is 27 ag census that show Indiana has about 254 acres of strawberry. That was reduced from over 400 10 years ago. So in 27, the recent data I have is 27. So it's about 254 acres and about 200 farmers. I assume most of the acres are in matted row system. And in recent years, there was a growing number of farmers who adapted the plasticulture system, especially I've seen in Southern Indiana. We also have a few farmers I know in Northern and Central Indiana grow strawberries on white plastic, plant bare root in summer and maintain the patch for at least 2 years. Then we have some farmers grow strawberry in tunnels. I also see a few cases of people grow strawberry hydroponic in greenhouse and use tabletop or vertical systems. Kevin, can you tell us a little of how strawberry are growing in your area?
Yeah, so here in Ontario, we've historically had a fairly good sized strawberry industry for the size of our province, where we probably have somewhere in the neighborhood of about 3,000 acres. It's a real variety of production systems here. Historically, we were all matted row, and then from matted row, growers started to switch into plasticulture with day-neutral strawberries primarily. And so there's probably 25% of well, it's probably more than that now, but at least 25 to 30% maybe plasticulture production. And so things are switching in. We're also doing a lot of tabletops now. It's I'd say a lot. It seems to be a lot over the past few years. And so there's tabletops and tunnels and high tunnels. And then there's also a very rapid growth in greenhouse glasshouse strawberry production here as well, obviously on tabletops. And substrate production. There's probably closing in on, it's going to probably be 200 acres of greenhouse strawberries here within the next year. So there's well over, probably closing in on 150 to my knowledge, maybe more than that right now. But there's more more construction going on to basically having winter strawberry production.
It's interesting to see the industries moving toward the tabletop system in Ontario region. It might be the future trend in Indiana as well. Okay, now back to today, our topic, weed management, which obviously would be more of a challenging in soil production, especially in open field. To have a good understanding of weed management, we do need to know what weed we are facing at different times of the year and the biology of the weeds. So now I would like to move to Steve.
Yeah, so I guess one way to kind of break down the different types of weeds that we see in strawberry production, it's going to depend on the system that you're in. So if we look at weeds from their life cycle standpoint, we have annuals that essentially live one growing season, biennials, which have 2 growing seasons, and then perennial weeds, which grow multiple years, right? So in annual plasticulture production systems, usually what we're going to see are winter annual weeds that are the most abundant and the most problematic. So those will be weeds that emerge in the fall, form a rosette or maybe a small clump in the case of something like chickweed. And then in the spring, when the temperature is warm, they bolt or flower, set their seed, and then usually die at some point. But sometimes they're pretty persistent and they'll stick around, into the strawberry harvest season. So those would be things like purple dead nettle or henbit, like we said, chickweed. Carolina geranium can fall in that category. It can be a winter annual or sometimes a biennial, depends on the production system. But and we also see some cool season grasses. So these might be grasses that germinated in the fall as well, or maybe they were they survived the pre-plant tillage practices because they can clump sometimes and make it through that process. So those are some of the weeds that we see this time of year in the plasticulture production system. If we move into more of a matted row system, we generally start to see more of the biennial weeds, and the perennial weeds show up as well. So those would be things like our Canada thistle, dandelion, which in this part of Indiana is in full bloom right now. Some of the docks, which have broken dormancy and are starting to grow this time of year as well. And then things like white clover are perennials that are problematic in these systems. Not a lot of biennial weeds. The classic example that we can think of would be something like wild carrot, where it germinates one year and forms a mat of leaves, and then flowers and sets seed the following growing season. So those are some of the broad categories that we have to contend with in the different production systems. So a lot of the weeds that we see this time of year actually germinated last fall or over the winter. So it just kind of depends. So some of the winter annual weeds, if we think about something like, I wanted to say horseweed, but that's 2 different weeds depending on where you are in the state of Indiana. Mare's tail or Canada fleabane is a classic fall emerging winter annual weed that we see in a lot of production systems in Indiana. For the most part, it's emerged before we do well. So it depends on the production system, but a lot of times, fall cultivation will take care of that particular weed in Indiana. Weeds like the henbit that you're seeing a lot flowering throughout the state of Indiana right now, that tends to germinate later into the fall and sometimes, into early winter. And in that case, that usually misses any kind of field prep disturbance that we have to the soil. And so it tends to be a little bit more problematic, I think, for us.
The follow-up question, Steve, how those weeds causing damage in strawberry production?
If we think about the impact of weeds on any crop in strawberry as well, they can compete for finite resources, that's light, water, and nutrients, which can decrease yield and quality. And quality is usually indicated by something like fruit size, for example. Between rows, if you have weeds that can interfere with harvesting processes, especially hand harvest. A lot of people who are picking berries don't like to walk through a very vegetated row middle because that means that there's a lot of dew they get wet feet. It's just not a very comfortable picking scenario. And then for individuals that have U-pick operations, it can also decrease kind of the pleasure from the U-pick experience. So if you've ever reached into matted row strawberry to try to pick a nice plump ripe strawberry fruit, and you get a handful of Canada thistle prickles in your hand, that's not a good experience. And it's certainly one that'll slow down your picking and may keep you from coming back for more, I suppose.
And I remember last strawberry chat, Jenna also mentioned of the disease, like the weeds could be the host of the disease as well. Steve, now the next thing I want to ask you, what are the common type of herbicides and the mode of action of those herbicides in strawberry production and registered in Indiana?
Moving into the herbicides, I'm also going to try to break that down into buckets as well, in case we have some listeners who may not be familiar with herbicides or may have been reluctant to use them. So I kind of think of herbicides in various categories as well. That helps me determine which one is most useful in different scenarios. So we can think of them as contact or systemic. So in the case of contact herbicides, the herbicide itself is really going to impact the green plant tissue that it touches. So this would be something like an AIM or gramoxone. They're not going to move through the plant, and if they do, they're not going to move very far. So it's more of a localized injury on the part of the green plant tissue that is contacted by the herbicide. Contrast that with systemic herbicides, which are actually moved throughout the plant. So this would be something like glyphosate or Roundup that's actually taken into the plant and moved to the growing points. Another example of this would be a lot of our grass selective herbicides, things like Select or Post. So that'd be clethodim and sethoxydim. And one of the reasons that they take so long to start to show symptoms in the weeds that we spray is because it does take time to take that chemical into the plant and then move it to the growing parts where it's effective. So that's contact versus systemic. We also have selective versus broad spectrum or non-selective herbicides. So another example of this, selective, our grass selective herbicides would be a good example of this, things like Post and Select. Another good example would be some of our auxinic herbicides, things like 2,4-D and clopyralid that have efficacy or control of broadleaf weeds, but won't do anything to help us manage emerged grasses. And we can contrast that with broad selective herbicides. So things like paraquat or Roundup, will control your strawberries just as well as they'll control the weeds. So, it's important to make sure that we keep those on target and where we want them to limit crop injury. The other kind of main way that we can categorize herbicides is the growth stage of the weed that they have an impact on. So pre-emergence versus post-emergence are the two broad categories. And when we say pre-emergence or post-emergence, we're really talking about the stage of the weed more so than the stage of the crop. And so pre-emergence or soil applied or residual herbicides that go by several different names are applied to the soil and usually require rainfall or some kind of soil incorporation to get into the uppermost portion of that soil. And as the weed seeds germinate, they either uptake that herbicide in their developing shoot tissues or root tissues as they grow through it, and that's where that control happens. Post-emergence, of course, happens after the weed has emerged, and hopefully when we use post-emergence herbicides, we're still targeting fairly small weeds, less than 3 or 4 inches tall, hopefully, and that gives us the best chance of controlling them. The other thing that we keep in mind with post-emergence herbicides is that we usually, especially if they're systemic, get the best control when weeds are actively growing. So small and actively growing weeds will tend to take up the herbicide better and have better control. So those are the broad categories. I know that's a lot to think about. Within that, we have different modes of action. So the WSSA or HRAC code that's located at the top of the herbicide label will tell you what the mode of action is. And basically that really tells us what part of the weed or the plant that is sprayed, what part of their biology is being affected. So that could be photosystem inhibition in the case of something like Turbicil or Cinbar. It could be a plant growth regulator in the case of Stinger or 2,4-D. In the case of grasses, it's a process known as ACCA's inhibition, and that's specific to grasses, and that's the reason it's just effective on grasses. So we'll stop it there so we don't bore too many people with herbicide physiology, but that's kind of an introduction to the herbicide aspect. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Steve. Okay, now Steve gave us an overview of the so many different types of herbicide, how it works. Now I want to move to Kevin, and I know Kevin has been growing strawberries and use those products for years. So I want to ask Kevin specifically to share your experience in using those herbicides to control weeds and different crop stages. I want to start with from the planting year and maybe before strawberry are planted. What are your journey strategies?
Yeah, I'd say that's probably one of the most important timings is prior to planting. It's like anything, you want to start with kind of with a clean slate, and perennial weeds, they're with you if you're in a matted row system and you're going to be carrying that over for a few years, or even a plasticulture system. You want to make sure that you do the best possible job at managing perennial weeds, and in most cases, it's use of a glyphosate type product, maybe in combination with something else to make it work a little bit more effectively. We'll see people using 2,4-D, or in some situations Stinger or clopyrrolid to use just to kind of make those materials a little hotter. But again, can't really emphasize enough to start off clean. So that's really important. And then from there on, and then in the planting year, we really look at some pre-plant incorporated herbicides. In the matted row system, it's pretty much automatic that growers are using. For us, it's Treflan or Trefluralin, and often dual herbicide. Sometimes they're using those in combination, pre-plant incorporated, depending on the weed pressure and so on. With the dual, you'll get incorporated, you get some nuts edge control, so that works well. What we have had an issue with, and just is that growers have used a pre-plant incorporated the dual and the Treflan together, and then they've made beds afterwards, and we've seen and laid plastic on top of that. And we've seen some serious damage to strawberries. So we're not sure what the exact cause is, whether it's the plastic not allowing that those herbicides to break down a little bit, or whether it's the accumulation of the herbicides when you bring that bed in. You're concentrating herbicides from the surface, but that's something that we've seen on a consistent basis and on a couple of occasions, year to year at the same planting, at different farms. So something to be aware of. But those two products are really helpful for us in a pre-plant year. So typically that's at planting time. And we'll see some people use products like Chateau or Spartan. The challenge of some of those is if you're in plasticulture, the recommendations are often to, they have to be 30 days before planting. So that makes things a little bit difficult. There are some people that will put, the label says that you can apply it to dormant plants. And there are some growers that have, planted dormant plants and immediately came back with those products. To me, it's a little bit risky. If there's any growth or any activity in those plants, there's a good chance you're going to burn them. So yeah, that's really buyer beware, so to speak. But it has been done, and growers have gotten some pretty good control. So that's kind of the pre-plant and planting stage. And then
you mentioned the in plasticulture, they apply the herbicide before planting and making beds, and this enables the herbicide to accumulate on the bed area, causing problems. So in those cases, I do hear sometimes growers ask me, like the label said, is the rate per acre. Like if they are using plasticulture, how they adjust the rate.
Yeah, that's a very good question, and it's not that it's really not that simple. I know in other production systems where you have a per acre rate, and then you're only spraying a small area, and we see that raspberries is a good example of that, where you have to adjust your rates and basically looking at what percentage of the field you're treating, and maybe it comes down to 20-25% of the field is actually in, or maybe more of a third if the row width and the alleyways were the same size. So yeah, that's kind of a tricky question, but yeah, you'd have to look at it, and it's somewhere between 50 and a third of the field, I would think. But Stephen may have a comment on that as well.
Yeah, this question came up at a Mellon meeting earlier in the year, and it's it's harder to describe in a podcast than it's easier to draw it on a whiteboard or something. But so we have broadcast equivalent acres, which would be, if you spread out the herbicide across an acre of land, regardless of banded or not, right? That's how much product goes out over an acre. And then we have the treated acre rate, which is the actual amount of product that goes out on the portion of the field that's treated, right? And so sometimes you just got to read the label and see, usually say we're spraying a pint of Dual, that's going to be in that treated acre area. So that's, if we take out, it's hard to describe, but essentially we want to make sure that our sprayer is calibrated so that we're delivering that product in that band at that treated acre rate. So if you're only treating half the field, you're basically spraying half the amount of chemical across the entire acre. But the portion of the field that's treated should get that full treated acre rate. I don't know if that makes sense, Minjing.
Yeah, it do make sense to me. I felt interesting since like growers, they spray herbicide, they spray fungicide, insecticide. Like when there are others, it's not herbicide, it probably look at the whole acre, like a watermelon, it's covered the entire acre. It's not the same case as a herbicide. I was thinking of the planting area, especially in the herbicide you spray plant. So you have to adjust the rate.
Yeah, I would think in the case of herbicides, I mean, you want that control in the alleyways as well as the bed if you're spraying a bed before laying plastic. But I think it gets to be the comment Stephen made about treated acres, that when you're looking at spraying those alleyways, because that's you're not getting weed control in there from the benefit of the plastic. So then you really have to you have to adjust those rates as well.
Yeah, that's really good point. How about we move to like after planting strawberries? What are your strategies?
After planting, there's a few tools that we use. There's not a lot of tools, unfortunately. We've got, I think 2,4-D is an option that most people have. So you can, that can go on to control small weeds and so on. You don't want it. We like to delay that to a minimum of 2 weeks after planting. Usually it's probably closer to 4. If you've done a good job with your pre-plant herbicides, you should get 4 to 6 weeks of control in most cases. This is kind of more, like I said, in the matter row system. You should get that. So coming in afterwards with a post-emergent treatment, we've got 2,4-D, which is an option. We also use Sinbar, but I'm not. I wouldn't say it's as the label states. We go with low rates, the low label rates, often anywhere as little as 1 ounce to 2.5 ounces. Putting that on 4 weeks after planting. And if we can, we like to water it in, just to wash it off the plant leaves. And some of our growers have done that. They'll put it on in a meadow row system. They'll apply that once a month. And sometimes they'll include Devonol with that, at probably a quarter rate Devonol, 2 pounds, somewhere around 2 pounds. And so that seems to be, you add up, you get a little bit of residual control, and that accumulates over time, and it seems to help keep things clean. So that's one of the things that we see growers doing. But yeah, we were using Beta Mix, but they're not. I don't think they're going to manufacture it any longer. It's not going to be available. And I'm not sure, Stephen, if you've got that registered in. Okay. Yeah, it was on very tiny weeds. It was very effective, but it was a commitment because really you had to go over it every couple of weeks and get those weeds. And there was a little bit of you'd see a little bit of setback on the plants, but they've always been a setback.
Kevin, did you see crop injury of using some of those herbicides post planting?
Yeah, I mean, 2,4-D usually goes on, but as I said, 2 to 4 weeks after planting, and it can go directly over the plants. You do see some varieties react a little bit stronger to it and have a little bit more, but we've never really seen any yield differences from damage to berries unless you go with your rate is too high or you use the wrong formulation of 2,4-D. So the recommendation is to use the amine formulation. A good example of crop injury last year, or mistakenly used the ester formulation, which was at the same rate as, but he would have used the amine, which the combination of that formulation change and higher concentration devastated the new planting of strawberries. So you really have to be cautious when you're using it.
Yeah, thanks. And Steve, do you want to add anything?
No, I will say, yeah. So one of the things that Kevin touched on was there could be some variety differences, and this is pretty well documented with Sinbar. There are extension pubs for various states that talk about the variance, their variability and susceptibility. So just if you spray it, get it off the leaves if the leaves are green. But yeah, so just something to be aware of, that maybe not all varieties will respond the same way. So just be cognizant of that, I guess, when you make your applications.
Yeah, and I would say that's the reason we developed. We as the growers developed this low rate. Using these low rates multiple times is because the varieties that we're growing are all very sensitive. The majority of them are quite sensitive to Sinbar. So that was kind of how they got around. I think when Sinbar was registered, it was registered on, I think, some varieties that were extremely tolerant, and you could put on quite a rate, and that is just quite difference between varieties and sensitivity.
That's a great point. Okay, now, Kevin, how about we move to fruiting year in the spring and in the fall? What's your typical?
Yeah. I just want to say in the planting year and in the fruiting year, it's very similar, but we have fall applications. So going into winter, whether it be planting year or not, we look at a residual herbicides. Historically, before the group 14 herbicides came around, we used Sinbar at higher rates when the plants were dormant, but now we're looking at much happier with products like Chateau and Spartan. Those group 14s are excellent products to overwinter, get those plants overwintered. But going into planting year, what we do sometimes, and I don't know whether it's labeled in your areas, but we will use a low rate of Sinbar, anywhere 3 to 4 ounces of Sinbar in the spring, mostly because those group 14s don't work well on grasses. So you get volunteer grain where you've got straw. We've got straw and matted rows, so that's where we've gotten to use this low rates of Sinbar, medium rates of Sinbar, we call it, just to control volunteer grains and perhaps some annual grasses at the same time. Going from there, I mean, we've got some grass herbicides. Stephen, we talked about those selective grass herbicides. We use Post and Ventures, the other one we don't have. Select, we're trying to get that one as a product, but we understand that Post isn't going to be manufactured anymore. So I don't know whether that's in the same case in the US, but that's kind of disappointing because it's a good product in certain grass species. So yeah, so we're looking at grass herbicides. The other thing that we do is we do some spot treating. And I talked a little bit about it. There's some spot treatments, perhaps of, there's some of those overwintered weeds that Stephen talked about, dandelion, and some of the ones that are in a rosette that are kind of easy to target with again, spot sprayings. Usually, some people like to use Roundup. I just don't like it because the room for error is pretty slim. So we'll use 2,4-D typically and it's nice. You can see the results of it fairly quickly to see what you've hit in this. But again, it's kind of a cautious approach to it where you're just using either a backpack sprayer or there's a tool out there that's kind of a dripping tool that some regulations. So
one of the things to keep in mind is just to keep an eye on those PHIs, right, as we get into spring. And I don't know what the rule of thumb you guys use, but usually if I see flowers, I plan on having fruit about 30 days later or so. So there are products that are registered to have a 30-day PHI. So if you see flowers, you're probably too late, right? So so just keep that in mind when we're making applications in the spring.
Yeah, we similar things. The grass herbicides are a good example of once you see some bloom on there, that's you're really not allowed to use them any longer.
Great, that's a lot of information here. I want to move to another topic. Steve, I know you are doing research on multi-year plasticultures, and we know for that systems, control the runners is one of the major challenges. You have been thinking of using chemicals to control runners. Can you share some of your thoughts here?
Yeah, I don't know that we have any results to share, Wenjing. I think anything I say at this point would just be speculation. And I don't know if Kevin or someone else on the call may have an answer. So what we're trying to do, growers in Indiana have an interest in growing strawberries in a plasticulture production system, but we usually can't get the yield in the first harvest year to justify the cost of the system. So the idea is to carry it through for a second growing season. That way, the investment in the plastic and the drip tape and the plants, is a one-time investment, and then we can hopefully get 2 harvests off of that investment. So what we will have to contend with is, what do we do post-harvest in this production system? And we're trying to figure that out. I don't know if maybe Kevin, if you've got some insight into that. But one of the things that we know we'll have to do is manage runners, because we don't want to take, we don't want them establishing in the row middles, and we don't want them taking resources from the mother plant, essentially. So
yeah, we're fortunate. I think we have Apogee registered, so that could be a tool, and I think I know that they've been trying to get registered for a long time in the US, and so that could be a tool that could be used, obviously very useful for managing runners. There's been some equipment, kind of it does a reasonable job of managing runners mechanically, but otherwise you're looking at, perhaps it's a matter of using some of those contact herbicides like bromoxone and some things that even if you get a little bit on the edge of the row, you're not going to kill those plants. But you could set the runners back at the same time. Just preventing those runners from rooting and so on would be helpful as well. But yeah, it's difficult, and we know that in day neutral strawberry production, manual jobs like deblossoming and removing runners is expensive, and is something that, that wish we had a better way. So there's, you can do a partial job with some of those burn down herbicides, but again, it's challenging to get that close without doing more damage to the to the mother plants.
Yeah, and I will say, I think one of the issues that we face in Indiana is that we don't have widespread adoption of very high beds yet. So the runners are still fairly close to that mother plant, and so if we can get some more separation, the use of a taller bed would help us maybe direct that spray just to the runner as it's hanging off, with less chance of injury to the mother plant.
Yeah, and there's some better hooded sprayers out there now that are coming along. So the hooded sprayers are, it's a great tool, and the plasticulture, and most growers have them. I mean, some of them have made their own. I've seen a lot of homemade, homemade hooded sprayers that, that are kind of adapted to that particular growing system that the grower has. And so, yeah, there's lots of different opportunities to, do a reasonable job. There's going to be, you have to, it's not perfect by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah, one of the things Wenjing had mentioned to me, Kevin, was the use of Devronol. Perhaps can you talk about that a little bit? It might inhibit some of the rooting of those runners. Is that right?
Yeah, that's always been our, we've always given that warning for matted row, producers to say, hey, don't use Devronol once your plants start to runner, because, you're looking for those runners to fill in rows. So yeah, it's a little bit different in that situation. Whereas in this situation, yeah, you maybe are going to get some weed control in there and prevent them from rooting. That thought crossed my mind, so I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah, we'll definitely try that out and see what it can do for us here. Thank you for that.
Okay, that's very interesting discussion. I was pick a few points. I felt I've definitely learned. It's like Steve mentioned of the height of the beds exactly, and even we have growers move to plasticultures. We still using the low beds, and when we come to those challenges, really everything is connected. When we have those taller beds, it will make the manage of the runners' ability it's easier compared to the fat beds.
Now I would like to move to another topic. We know one of the problems of using herbicides is weed could develop resistance to some of the chemicals. Steve, Kevin, have you seen some of those stories in strawberry field?
As weed scientists, we try to keep track of all the herbicide resistance. Most of the herbicide resistance in weeds is going to be documented on the row crop side of things. I just looked at the weedscience.org website before we started this podcast to see if I could find any documented resistance in strawberry, and strawberry is not even listed as a crop in that system. So in Indiana, though, we have at least 18 documented herbicide weed resistant cases. A lot of that is going to be our pigweeds. So because they get treated with so many different herbicides in our row crops, we have pigweeds and water hemps that have resistance to glyphosate, our PPO inhibitors, which is group 14 herbicides, our group 2 or ALS inhibitor herbicides, and our group 5 or photosystem 2 inhibitors. We also have some glyphosate resistant ragweed, both common, which we can see in strawberry matted row strawberry production, and giant ragweed, which is germinating this time of year. And then of course we have herbicide resistant mare's tail, but also herbicide resistant lamb's quarters. So that might be one in a multi-year system that we would see start to emerge in the summer that could be problematic. There's also some so photosystem 2 inhibitor resistance with our lamb's quarters. So I think anytime we spray weeds with herbicides, we put selection pressure on that population of weeds, and we kind of move gradually toward weeds that are more resistant to herbicides. So we see that from a side of action perspective, from weeds that either they get around the herbicide or they can put it somewhere in the plant that it's not harmful, or they can metabolize it really quickly. But we're also starting to see other types of non-site specific resistance. So there's weeds are kind of outsmarting us every chance they get. So it's important that we don't rely just on chemical weed control, and that we are aware of populations that may appear in our field. So if a herbicide has always worked in your field with a certain population of weeds, and then all of a sudden you start to see survivors, that may be an indication that we have some resistance starting to appear. And it's something, perhaps worth roguing those plants out to try to get ahead of it.
Yeah, I just comment that we have seen some specific resistance issues in strawberry fields here, and I think it's the same groups as Stephen mentioned. It's a group 5s, and which is where Sinbar lies, and then the group 14s are the ones we depend on, with sulfentrazone and Chateau, those products. So yeah, I guess we can expect to see it, especially going back to the same fields in continuous years. So yeah, there's documented resistance. We've heard the talk from pathologists and entomologists about rotation and tank mixing and different things. So I think it's something that we're going to have to think more and more about with managing weeds as well.
Thanks, Kevin, Steve. And next, when I'm talking to farmers, they always share with me some of their favorite tools. So I want to ask you, Kevin, do you have some tools you think it's very helpful and you want to share with our audience here?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I talked a little bit about some of the spot treatments and so on. So I'm hoping you can see this. So this is the product that we call it's called a selector, and it's the one that I was doing that I've said we'd use for weeds in the planting year or in spring prior to harvest. And so it's basically it's a dripper, and it works on a trigger. It's got a little tank on top, and I think I can go back and show the tank, but it's just a small tank. Probably I don't even know how much it would hold it, but it can't be too big because you wouldn't want to carry around one. But you can see it's got a long one, so you can point it right down into the plant, and that's where and as you pull the trigger, it puts out a number of drips, and you can adjust that. But yeah, we would put this on dandelion or something along those lines and it would it works really well on that. So that's something, and they said it's nice, and we find that the employees really like it because it's easy. They don't have to bend down. It's selective as the name of it sounds. You can get in there and reduce the amount of damage. And as I said before, I like to see something like 2,4-D used, and we use I think about a 5% solution of 2,4-D on that, and it's great. It's great for taking out dandelions and other plants like that. So that is one of my favorite tools. It's not inexpensive to buy, and it's not I wish it was more durable. I mean, there's little parts that sometimes you have to replace. So, but yeah, it's kind of a nice tool. I was hoping that somebody would come out with one that's a bit more durable. That one comes all the way from Europe, I think, and there's one Canadian supplier that I know of that sells it. They sell quite a few of them. Yeah, it's a good tool, and I know growers that have that'll have a dozen of them or whatever. They're large growers that send their guys out to do 30 or 40 acres of strawberries in the spring of the year.
Cool. Hope we have more of those tools in the market.
Yeah.
Growers can access it better.
I should make one myself. I should be.
Cool. Steve, do you have anything you want to share?
No, I need to get one of those, Kevin. Try it
I
out.
was thinking that too. We need to get one at their farm.
Any excuse to get a new tool is
Yeah.
good by me.
Yeah, it'd be good. It'd be great for you to have one, Stephen, and you could show it off at prayer meetings and so on, and try it out and find its weaknesses, and maybe we can build a better one.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll what I'll do is, engineers, I'll share the contact for that, the supplier with you. Please.
That would be wonderful. Okay. Kevin and Steve, I do want to ask you this. I know some of our audience, they tend not to use synthetic chemicals in their production, including herbicides. In those situations, what would be your recommendations?
Yeah, I've seen different things used. I mean, it depends on how in the extension. We had a grower growing in plasticulture that actually planted a grass species. I can't recall. It was probably a ryegrass or something like that, and just use that as a bit of a row cover to keep the weeds down, and then he would go in and mow it on a regular basis as needed. So that cover was suppressing weeds. Obviously, straw is an advantage as well. We've seen some research that's been done on using paper, and it's kind of I don't know how you describe it. Stephen may have a better idea of it, but yeah, they've used that, and I've had growers try that, and it works pretty well. I mean, it's like anything else, getting it placed and it's the row right up against the plastic that's always the hard part to get. But if you can cover the majority of that area with this paper, and it was kind of cast off paper that they were using, so it wasn't as expensive. But kind of I don't know, we call it it's a little heavier type of paper. Yeah, that was something that one of our researchers tried here, and it worked well. It hasn't had a lot of adoption, but some growers have tried it.
Yeah, I think you stand the best chance in a plasticulture system, because that is going to help you manage the weeds in the row, right? So you'll still have weeds in the planting hole that you'll probably have to hand remove, but we may have to do that in conventional systems too if we don't have a product that's labeled and effective in those scenarios. Yeah, like Kevin mentioned, we're looking at cover crops as well, planted in the row middles in the fall. So things like rye and oats and maybe even white clover. So a low growing perennial in the case of if we want to keep those plantings for multiple years. Hopefully that will give us some ground cover and hopefully not compete too much with our crop for water. Choosing a cover crop that's fairly low growing would be helpful, so that you're not contributing to blocking sunlight from reaching the strawberries themselves. And then certainly if you have something like a rear discharge mower, you can maybe keep those cover crops or vegetation in the row middles mowed fairly routinely without throwing the cut part onto your strawberries, I guess. Some more novel things that are being investigated at Cornell and Oregon State is electrocution of weeds in perennial fruit production systems. So that's not something that we see a lot of, but it's being researched. So that's a non-chemical weed control option as well. And then any kind of mulch that we can put in row middles would be very helpful. So straw, if you've had that to cover in the winter, move it to the row middles. So one thing with straw though, I guess Kevin alluded to this too, is you will start to get some straw growing in your row middles.
We're close to the time, we really appreciate Kevin and Steve participate our strawberry chat, share their very valuable knowledge with us. That will be the end of our program today.
You're very welcome.
Thank you,
Thank
and
you.
Jane.
Have a great day.
All right.
Bye.
Well,